This is Book Talk with Corbin, and I'm your host. And we have a returning guest, Dr. John Lott. So go to my website, booktalkwithcorbin.com, and look up Dr. John Lott to get the first interview. And one of the first things you're going to find out is this man has an extensive academic background. I mean, we can sit here literally for 5 minutes to talk about this man's absolutely tremendous accomplishments. When he finds the time to sleep, I don't know. But thank God he does what he does. Two books in particular I would really like to encourage my listeners, you listeners, to pick up is More Guns, Less Crime, and then the book Gun Control Myths. And he has just recently told me before we came on that he's written 10 books. And so I would suspect all of them are pretty good. Doctor, is there a particular place where we can go other than Amazon.com to get copies of your books?
Well, I mean, they can find all my writings at our website at crimeresearch.org, crimeresearch.org.
Crimeresearch.org. So, that's great. Doc, I just wanted to ask you, today we wanted to bring you on because I wanted you to talk a little bit about, your perspective on the Supreme Court nominee, Judge Brown. But before I do that, I just wanted to ask you one quick question. Here in Louisville, Kentucky, we have a couple of candidates running, and they keep putting forth the argument that, hey, more crime, more poverty, more crime. And they use that as justification to sort of want to advocate more and more gun control. Do you,
Right.
in your research, have you found that to be true? Oh, okay, poverty produces crime, and therefore somehow or another that justifies more gun control.
Well, I mean, those are two separate issues to begin with. But what I would say is that there's really not a lot of evidence that poverty is related to crime. It's very tiny effect that's there. But, with regard to gun ownership, I'd actually argue the relationship's the other way. The people who are most likely victims of violent crime tend to be poor people. And my research shows me that they're the ones who benefit the most from having a gun to be able to go and protect themselves. Police are very important. But the police themselves know that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occurred.
Yes.
And my research finds that there's basically two groups of people who benefit the most from gun ownership. And one is the most likely victims of violent crime, and that overwhelmingly tends to be poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas.
Yes.
And my concern is that a lot of the gun control laws actually disarms those people in particular. So you're in Washington, D.C., and you have a private transfer of a gun. It costs $125 to do a legal private transfer there through a background check.
Wow.
They may not stop me from being able to go and get a gun, but the very people who need it the most are the ones who are going to get stopped. So Kentucky's next to Illinois and Indiana. Just compare the laws in those two states. You have in Indiana, over 22% of the adult population is a concealed handgun permit. In Illinois, it's 4%. Why the difference? Well, it's pretty easy to understand. In Indiana, permits cost $12.95 for the background check. That's the total cost for getting it. In Illinois, the total cost for getting a permit is about $450.
Wow.
So you make it a lot more costly. A lot fewer people go and get a permit. But it's worse than that, because if you look at who gets the permit, in Illinois, it's overwhelmingly wealthy whites who live in the suburbs. It's fine that they go and get permits. I'm glad they can protect themselves, but they're not the ones who are most likely going to be victims of violent crime. In Indiana, it's much more in heavily poor minority zip codes that you see people going and getting concealed handgun permits. You're going to see a bigger reduction in crime in Indiana from that than in Illinois, because one, with more permits, it's riskier for criminals to go and attack people. But two, it's the people who they're most likely to attack who are the ones who are going to be able to go and defend themselves. So, I look at these things, and Democrats claim that they care about poor people, that they care about minorities. And I look at these rules that they have. So in Chicago, up until recently, there's no training facilities there. Concealed handgun permits are banned on public transportation. So if you were a poor person who lived in Chicago and you have to get 16 hours of training in order to go and obtain your concealed carry permit, well, guess what? You're going to have to, if you don't own a car yourself, you're going to have to go and borrow somebody's car for either 2 or 4 days to go well outside the city to be able to go and get the training to go and get the permit. We're talking about $450. We're not even talking about the price of the gun or anything like that. We're just talking about the cost for getting the permit that's there.
Yes.
And so it's kind of like they've gone through every step they could to say, well, we don't let them take it on public transportation. We make them have to pay these high fees. We make it very inconvenient. It's just like they've done everything they possibly can to prevent poor people from having the option to go and protect themselves. A few years ago, I was able to get the list of all the concealed carry permits in Los Angeles County, California. They had a little bit over 300 permits that were there out of an adult population of about 8.5 million people. But, the thing is, who do they give the permits to? So in Los Angeles, in 7 states are what they call may issue states, where you have to go to some local public official and justify to them why you should be able to have a gun to be able to go and protect yourself and your family. And the thing is, I can look to see who they give them to. Only about 7% of the permit holders in Los Angeles County are women. Only 5% are Black. Only 6% are Hispanic. Over 12% of the population in Los Angeles County is Black. Is it just that Blacks in Los Angeles County aren't victims of crime like they are in the rest of the country? Women nationwide, women make up about almost 30% of permit holders. They only make up 7% there. Are women not stalked or threatened in Los Angeles County?
Right.
No, I mean, and nationwide, about 13% of permit holders are Black. So what happens is that the types of people that they give permits to are very wealthy, very politically connected individuals, many people who give money to the sheriff's campaign that's there. And you're in a situation where, it's fine. You get wealthy whites, men who go and get permits, and a number of Asian men too. But they're not the ones who are most likely victims of crime. And so here you have a city that's completely controlled, a county that's completely controlled by Democrats. They're the ones who make the decision who they think has a good reason for doing it. But if you live, in Watts or some of the other poorer areas of Los Angeles, good luck trying to go and get a concealed handgun permit. They don't care whether you live in a dangerous area or not. You have to provide what they think is a good reason. And apparently, the only people that they pretty much think have good reasons are people who give a lot of money to the sheriff's campaign and stuff.
Right. Folks, this is Book Talk with Corbin. I'm interviewing Dr. John Lott. He's an American economist and gun rights advocate.
I'm not an advocate per se. That's the type of thing that's on Wikipedia or what have you, where yes. Look, I'm a researcher. My views have changed a lot over time when I've worked on this. If you had talked to me 20 years ago, there's no way I would have believed the type of stuff that I'm talking about now. I try to go where the data is on these types of things. And that's basically how my views have evolved over time.
Truth spoken like a true scholar there, Doctor, and the author of 10 books. And one of them is More Guns, Less Crime, and Gun Control Myths. And I want to encourage people to please go to crimeresearch.org to get copies of those books. Doc, before we leave here, I'd like to get some of your insights or perspective on the recent Supreme Court nominee, Judge Brown, She was nominated by the Biden administration. And can you share with us some of your thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, one of the things that came up with it was that she was at the Sentencing Commission. She was a commissioner there. I was actually chief economist at the Sentencing Commission, not at the same time that she was there. And I look at her record, and she frequently goes well below the minimum sentences for crimes. Never goes above the Sentencing Commission's recommended maximum. And lots of judges deviate, but they may deviate low sometimes. Once in a rare moon, deviate high, but she very frequently goes below the sentencing advised minimum that's there. And her reasons for doing it just didn't make any sense at all to me. So, one of the things that came up a lot during the hearings was these child pornography cases. And she was arguing that there should be lesser penalties for people who bought child pornography over the internet versus those who let's say, buy it through the mail, because she said it was so much easier for them to go and get it via the internet. Here's the problem. Let's say I figured out an easier way to break into people's homes. All right. So I'm able to go and break into more people's homes. Should I face lower criminal penalties than another criminal who couldn't figure out as easy of a way to break into people's homes? The fact that I figured out an easier way to break into people's homes, does that mean that I should face lesser criminal penalties? Mm-hmm. And the answer is no. Okay. I would hope most people would believe that, because the penalty should be related to the harm that's caused, that rather than how easy or hard it is for me in particular to go and commit that crime. So, for example, what's the harm from child pornography? The harm from child pornography, at least in large part, is that the more people who pay for child pornography, the greater the demand for child pornography, the more children are going to be caught up in child pornography, because people are going to have a profit for producing it. And so that's the harm. So whether I buy it through the internet, 100 photos, or I buy 100 photos through the mail, I'm creating the same amount of harm for kids there, because I'm having the same increase in demand for child pornography that's there. And, so here you have a situation where, look, we've had a huge increase in violent crime over the last couple of years. To me, it seems pretty straightforward what's happened. You have major prosecutors, district attorneys in many major cities who are refusing to prosecute violent criminals. You have police budgets being cut. In New York City, they cut the police budget by $1 billion a year. In Chicago, the mayor there wanted to cut the budget by $400 million a year. $80 million a year, cutting 400 police officers there. And others have put restrictions on police officers. You have bail system changing. You've had massive number of inmates being released from jails and prisons across the country. In many urban areas, over half, and some over 2/3 of the inmates who were in jail have been released over the last 2 years because of the coronavirus. Well, I don't think it's rocket science. You make it less risky for criminals to go and commit crime, and they're going to go and commit more crime. And the thing is, who gets harmed by this? The people who gets harmed are the people who live in relatively poor crime areas in these cities. So they're the ones who are the victims of crime directly. Businesses in those areas are harmed. Many of those businesses are owned by minorities. Who do you think primarily works in those areas? Primarily minorities. Who do you think shops in those stores? Primarily minorities. Who do you think owns houses in many of those areas? Primarily minorities, whose property values are hurt when you have increased crime in those areas. And so, you know, Biden wants to just focus on guns with regard to that issue. I don't think most people realize this, but 92% of violent crime has nothing to do with guns. Okay. Less than 8% has something to do with guns. And so, you do the same things to reduce gun violence that you do to reduce any type of violent crime. You go and you make it riskier for criminals to go and commit crimes. But just focusing only on gun control, and I think his gun control things are going to make it particularly difficult. His big push, he wants to have universal background checks on guns like they have in Washington, D.C. We talked about that briefly earlier. $125 fee for the background check for a gun, to transfer a gun. Who does he think he's going to primarily stop from being able to go and own guns for protection? Not me, okay, but people who are poor, who are likely to be victims of violent crime in these urban areas. And so, to me, it's not surprising about Judge Jackson there. She's been a public defender for much of her career before she became a judge. They, of course, tend to be relatively liberal in terms of sentencing. And, it shows up in her actual sentencing and beyond, so like there's 7 child pornography cases where she went well below the minimum suggested penalty from the Sentencing Commission. But that's just one example. There's all sorts of violent crimes where she has done similar deviations from what was recommended that other judges tend to primarily follow. And, it's not surprising to me that a lot of criminal rights groups have supported her, that she's getting very strong support from those groups. And, it's one thing to have her as a district court judge. It's another thing to have her as a circuit court judge, but she's only been there for a very short time, hasn't even released one opinion yet there. And now she's going to have huge impacts potentially on criminal sentencing, criminal law, how difficult it is for police to be able to go and do their jobs. And I worry that the end result of having justices like her on the Supreme Court are going to harm a lot of poor people, because it's going to result in higher crime than you would have gotten otherwise.
Wow. Folks, this is Book Talk with Corbin. I'm your host. Go to my website, booktalkwithcorbin.com, and you'll see my prior interview with Dr. Lott. And, of course, we'll have this one posted. Dr. Lott is obviously a brilliant scholar, if you listen to him. And he's published 10 books, including More Guns, Less Crime, and Gun Control Myths. Go to the website, crimeresearch.org, to get those books. It's very, very important we reread these kind of books. And speaking as a person who lives in a high crime area, I deeply appreciate many of the things he's just said, because he's spot on. He's absolutely spot on. Doctor, I hope we can do this again sometime.
Well, I appreciate your time, Corbin. Thank you very much.
You bet.